So, the Amazing World of Gumball. If you watched Cartoon Network at any point between 2011 and 2019, you probably have at least some memory of it. A blue cat and his goldfish brother getting into low-stakes catastrophes in a town that looks like it was designed by someone who had access to every animation software ever made and decided to use all of them simultaneously. Loud, cheerful, constantly breaking its own rules. The kind of show you'd put on in the background and then find yourself actually watching 20 minutes later, slightly confused about how you got there. I've been thinking about Gumball a lot lately. Not in any serious, academically rigorous way, more in the way you think about something you loved when you were younger and then start to realise, years on, was doing something far stranger and more interesting than you noticed at the time. And once that realisation starts, it's difficult to stop pulling at the threads. So that's what we're going to do tonight, or this morning, or whatever time it is where you are. We're going to wander through Elmore at a very relaxed pace, stopping to look at the things that never quite got explained, the theories that people have built up around the show's mythology, and the genuinely unusual creative decisions that make Gumball unlike anything else that's ever been on children's television. A bit of orientation first for anyone who's a bit fuzzy on the details. The Amazing World of Gumball ran on Cartoon Network from 2011 to 2019, 6 seasons, 240 episodes, created by a French animator named Ben Bocquelet, who was working at a studio in Manchester and had a collection of rejected character designs he'd accumulated over years of commercial animation work. Characters he'd pitched that didn't fit anywhere, visual ideas that got turned down, little odd creatures that existed in sketchbooks and nowhere else. He took all of them and put them in a town together and made a show about it. The main family are the Wattersons. Gumball is 12, a blue cat, bright and imaginative, and frequently wrong about things in ways that cause moderate municipal damage. Darwin is his best friend and adoptive brother, a goldfish who grew arms and legs one day and started attending school with the rest of the family, which everyone accepted without comment. Anais is the youngest, 4 years old, measurably the most intelligent member of the household, and resigned to this fact. Richard is the father, pink rabbit, large, unemployed, deeply committed to doing nothing at all. And Nicole is the mother, a blue cat like Gumball, the person who holds the entire structure together through a combination of genuine love and what appears to be barely contained volcanic energy. They live in Elmore. Elmore is a town in what appears to be the American Midwest, except that it borders the sea, has mountains nearby, experienced a tropical heatwave once, and also has a desert in driving distance. Geography is one of the show's many flexible concepts. The residents of Elmore are visually extraordinary. Some are hand-drawn 2D cartoons like the Wattersons, some are 3D computer renders, some appear to be clay models, some are clearly stop-motion animated objects, like a toaster or a piece of toast attending school as regular students. Mr. Small, the school counsellor, is a purple pom-pom with a face. Terry is a paper bear. The student population of Elmore Junior High includes a literal T-Rex, a cloud, a balloon, and a slice of pizza. Nobody in Elmore has ever found any of this remarkable. The show uses this visual chaos deliberately, and we'll get into how and why as the night goes on. But that's the starting point. A mixed media cartoon about a chaotic family in a town where the rules of reality have been negotiated rather than established. Now, if this were a different kind of video, I'd be building to something, foreshadowing the big reveals, layering in tension. But this is sleep content, which means we're not doing any of that. We're just going to wander, one topic to the next, at whatever pace feels comfortable. Each bit stands on its own. So if you drift off halfway through the part about Banana Barbara's prophecies, that's genuinely the intended outcome. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you want to subscribe, the button's around somewhere. And if you've already made the decision to put this on and close your eyes, then I hope it's a comfortable night wherever you are. Let's start somewhere before the theories, because I think the show itself deserves a bit of attention before we start pulling it apart. Before we actually get into any of the theories, I want to mention something about how Gumball was received when it first came out, because I think it's relevant to why the fan community around it is so invested in the deeper lore. When the show premiered in 2010, the critical response was largely in the register of charming but lightweight, a pleasant visual novelty, good for kids. The mixed media aesthetic was appreciated as a creative choice, but the assumption from a lot of reviewers was that this was a show that would be funny and weird without being particularly substantive. That it would do its jokes, run for a few seasons, and end without leaving much of an impression beyond that cartoon with all the different art styles. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Not dramatically wrong in the first few seasons, because the show was still finding its feet, and the lore was largely undeveloped. But by season 4, and certainly by season 6, the show had built something that its early reception hadn't accounted for. A mythology with genuine internal consistency, a set of ideas that developed across years rather than episodes, and a fan base that's engaged with it seriously. As a result, the Gumball fandom did what engaged fandoms do. They reread the show. They went back to season 1 with the knowledge of where things ended up, and they found things they hadn't seen the first time. Background details that turned out to be foreshadowing. Episodes that read entirely differently in light of later revelations. Small moments that had seemed like throwaway gags and turned out to be structural clues. The kind of careful, patient storytelling that rewards exactly this sort of retrospective attention. This is the context for everything we're going to discuss. These theories didn't emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a community that loved the show enough to read it carefully, and from a show that had earned that careful reading by consistently putting more in than it needed to. The first thing you notice about the Amazing World of Gumball, if you're paying any attention at all to the craft of it, is that it shouldn't work. Visually, it's a mess. The characters in any given scene might be drawn in 4 or 5 completely different styles, at wildly different levels of detail and dimensional complexity. You'll have Gumball, who is a smooth flash-animated 2D cartoon, standing next to Bobert, who is a meticulously rendered 3D robot, next to Mazami, who is a simple watercolor cloud shape, next to Terry, who is literally a piece of paper. In live-action environments, sometimes, in the middle of what appear to be live-action landscapes. The Amazing World of Gumball uses photo-based, digitally composited backgrounds. The aesthetic register of any given scene is essentially whatever the creative team felt like that day. And yet it works, not despite the chaos, but because of it. The visual inconsistency becomes its own language, one of the things that makes Elmore feel genuinely unlike any other animated setting. The reason for it, as Bockley explained in various interviews, is essentially biographical. He had spent years in commercial animation, pitching characters that got rejected, designs that were too weird, concepts that didn't fit the brief, creatures that ended up in a drawer because nothing had a use for them. When he got the chance to make his own show, he pulled everything out of the drawer. Every rejected character got a home. Every visual idea that didn't belong anywhere else found its place in Elmore. There's something I find genuinely moving about that origin story in a quiet sort of way. The show is literally made of things that were told they didn't belong. And then it put them all together in a town and said, right, you all belong here, next to each other, in whatever form you happen to take. Now, the reason this matters beyond the aesthetic is that the show gradually becomes self-aware about it. Not immediately. In the early seasons, the mixed media thing is largely a visual joke, a background gag. Look at how strange this is, isn't that funny? Moving on. Season 1 is mostly a pretty conventional kids show about a moderately chaotic family. The plots are small, the stakes are domestic. Gumball breaks something, Darwin feels bad about it. Anais solves it with minimal recognition. But something starts shifting in season 2 and 3. The show gets interested in its own architecture. It starts asking questions, mostly through comedy, about what it means to exist in a world where the rules are so evidently made up. Characters begin to notice, in small ways, that Elmore operates differently from how a world should operate. Logic gets weird. Consequences stop following from causes in quite the way they should. And then in season 4 and beyond, the show essentially commits. It decides that the strange visual world of Elmore isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's a metaphysical fact with implications that the characters are going to have to reckon with. This is where the real mythology of the show lives, and it's where most of the theories we're going to talk about tonight have their roots. There's also a craft observation worth making here. The show's willingness to use different animation techniques isn't just visual variety for its own sake. Different characters genuinely feel different because they look different. Bober being a 3D render makes him feel more rigid, more precise, more robotic, even before he opens his mouth. Terry being a paper cutout makes her feel fragile, two-dimensional in a way that extends beyond her literal flatness. The Wattersons being smooth, expressive 2D characters makes them feel warmer, more malleable, more emotionally accessible. The show is using its visual vocabulary to communicate something about each character's nature, even in the background. The human characters, when they appear at all, tend to look slightly more realistic than the Elmore residents, more detailed, more textured, which becomes important later because The Inquisition, the series finale, uses real live-action human actors in a very specific way. But that's a topic for much later tonight. One more thing I want to mention before we move on, because it's a detail I think gets overlooked. The show ran in a lot of countries and was slightly different in each of them. The British-produced episodes have a particular flavour. The humour is a bit drier. The absurdism is calibrated slightly differently. Bockley's background means the show has a European sensibility that sits interestingly against its American Midwest setting. It's a British-made show set in America about a family that behaves in ways that feel neither quite British nor quite American, but something sui generis, something Elmore specific. I think that cultural in-betweenness is part of why the show feels slightly uncanny even before you start digging into the lore. It never quite settles into a recognisable register. It's always just slightly off, just slightly weirder than it needs to be, which turns out to be exactly right for a show about a town where the rules of existence are negotiable. Anyway, let's start with the big one, the concept that everything else in the show's mythology eventually runs through. There's a craft detail about the visual inconsistency that I keep coming back to when I think about the show's construction. In most animated series, the art style is a contract with the audience. It defines the rules of the world. If everything is hand-drawn, you know the world operates on hand-drawn physics and hand-drawn emotional logic. If it's 3D, similarly. The aesthetic creates a unified frame. Gumball refuses this contract entirely, and what's interesting is that, rather than feeling incoherent as a result, it creates a world that feels more real in a specific and strange way than a more consistent aesthetic would. Because the real world is also visually inconsistent. You walk down any high street and you're moving through architecture from 5 different centuries in 50 meters. The design language of your phone is completely different from the design language of your coat. Things exist next to each other that weren't made to coexist, that have no aesthetic relationship, that simply happen to occupy the same space at the same time because that's how reality accumulates itself. It doesn't have a unified art direction. Elmore, by using multiple incompatible visual registers, accidentally replicates this quality of the real world. It feels like a place that accreted rather than was designed, even though it was very carefully designed by the creative team. The apparent incoherence is, paradoxically, what makes it feel plausible. The show was also notably willing to change its own rules over time in ways that most animated series try to avoid. Characters whose designs shift slightly between seasons, backgrounds that look different depending on when an episode was made, visual gags that rely on the audience being familiar with the show's existing conventions in order to appreciate the subversion. Gumball never locked itself into an unchanging aesthetic because change was built into its DNA from the start. A show made of misfit concepts was always going to be comfortable with the idea of evolving. Ben Bocquelet departed from the show after season 6 ended, later returning as showrunner for the revival. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball has continuity with the original, but is visibly a different creative sensibility in charge of the same town. This is not necessarily a flaw. Towns change hands, places survive their original inhabitants. Elmore under new management is still Elmore, which is part of what the meta-narrative of the show was always about. The characters and the world are not simply coextensive with the people who made them. I want to circle back to something I mentioned early on, because I think it deserves more space than it initially got. The relationship between an Elmore character's visual style and their nature as a being within the show's universe. Consider the implications of Terry being made of paper. She is literally a two-dimensional object living in what is, for most of the other characters, a three-dimensional world. She can be crumpled, she can be wet, which would presumably be catastrophic. She can be cut or torn or written on. She attends school, she has friendships, she worries about her health with hypochondriac energy. She is fully a person, and she is also a piece of paper. In The Inquisition, when Superintendent Evil begins his program of cartoonishness removal, one of the first things he does is erase Terry's face. He doesn't harm her physically, as we'd understand physical harm. He edits her. He treats her as the medium she's made of rather than as the person she is. And this is presented as violence, as a genuine violation, because the show has spent years establishing that being made of paper doesn't diminish Terry's personhood. Her visual medium is not herself. Bobert is an interesting comparison. He's a 3D rendered robot who is also a student, also a person, but whose visual register suggests precision and rigidity where Terry suggests fragility. Bobert's episodes tend to be about the limits of his understanding, the things he can compute but not feel, the ways his physical nature creates constraints in his social and emotional life. His 3D render quality isn't just aesthetic, it's characterization. The donut cop, who appears throughout the series as Elmore's recurring law enforcement presence, is shaped like a donut. His job is, in effect, to maintain order in a world that comprehensively defies it. The visual pun is on the surface obvious, but the character is also a fairly thoughtful depiction of someone who believes in the system he works for, even when that system produces absurd outcomes. He's earnest about being a donut-shaped police officer in a town of anthropomorphic food and furniture. His commitment is entirely sincere. What the show is doing, across its entire visual vocabulary, is using the medium of animation in a way that live action simply cannot replicate. Characters can be physically defined by their emotional or social role in ways that bodies in the real world are not. The paper girl, whose fragility is literal, not metaphorical. The robot whose rigidity is physical as well as psychological. The ancient primate whose prehistoric nature is visible in her appearance and her age simultaneously. Elmore's residents are, in a sense, more honest about what they are than we are, because they can't help being visually legible. This connects interestingly to Penny's arc. She was the character who was least visually legible, whose exterior gave the least information about who she was inside. And the show treats the removal of that exterior as a liberation, as the specific thing she needed to do to be herself fully. After meeting Finn and Jake, Penny is visually transparent and fully legible. One thing that I think gets underweighted when people discuss Gumball's lore and mythology is how funny the show actually is. And I mean this not as a caveat but as an explanation. The meta-narrative and the void and all the cosmological machinery only work as well as they do, because the comedy is solid enough that you're genuinely invested before any of the heavy lifting starts. Gumball's humour operates on several levels simultaneously. There's the physical slapstick, which is inventive and specific in the way good cartoon physical comedy needs to be. There's the verbal comedy, which is sharp and often very fast, relying on the show's willingness to let characters make genuinely bad arguments with full commitment. There's the meta-humour, jokes about the show's own construction. And there's the observational comedy, the show's interest in the textures of ordinary life. The observational comedy is what I find most interesting from a craft perspective, because it's where the show's specificity really shows. Gumball has a lot of jokes about the kinds of things that only feel familiar if you've lived in a certain kind of lower middle class household. The specific quality of cheap food. The arguments about who used the last of something and didn't replace it. The dynamic of a parent trying to be present while exhausted. The texture of being a child who is mostly fine and occasionally not fine. These jokes land differently depending on your own experience, which is true of the best observational comedy. If your childhood had a Richard-shaped figure in it, the jokes about Richard hit differently than if it didn't. If you had a Nicole-shaped figure, similarly, the show knows exactly what kind of household it's depicting, and it depicts it with enough accuracy that it creates recognition rather than caricature. This emotional specificity is what distinguishes Gumball from a lot of the animation that was being made concurrently. It wasn't trying to be the most exciting or the most elaborate or the most epic thing on television. It was trying to be funny and true. And when it became strange and mythological and cosmologically ambitious, it kept the truth. The Void is terrifying, partly because it's framed in the context of characters whose everyday lives we understand and care about. This isn't something I've mentioned, and it probably deserves a note. The Amazing World of Gumball has remarkably good music for a children's cartoon. The score by Tom Parkinson, and later other composers, is genuinely inventive, frequently doing things that you don't expect from animation of this kind. The show is willing to use silence effectively, which is surprisingly rare. It's willing to let a joke breathe rather than filling the audio space immediately. And it's willing to let music carry emotional weight in the quieter, more serious moments without doing so with such obvious manipulation that you notice it happening. The theme song is one of the catchier ones from the era, which is a reasonably low bar for children's television, but it's genuinely good. It sets the tone efficiently. Chaotic, cheerful, slightly anarchic, aware of its own strangeness. More interesting is the way the show uses different musical registers in its more experimental episodes. The episode The Singing features characters who can only communicate through song for a period, which gives the show a chance to do something genuinely musical rather than just animated. The Puppets has a distinctly different sonic identity from most of the series. The show was comfortable changing its audio texture when the episode required it, which is part of why it never quite settled into a recognizable formula. The Void is introduced quietly, which I think is part of why it hits so hard when you go back and notice it. Needs review. It appears briefly in Season 2 in an episode called The Void. Gumball and Darwin notice that a classmate named Molly has disappeared. Not just moved away, disappeared from memory, from photos, from conversation. In the episode, nobody at school remembers Molly except Gumball and Darwin. There's a faint unease in the show as the boys try to work out what's happened, and eventually they find their way to this other place. Needs review. A dimension that looks like television static, floating debris, glitching objects, chunks of what appear to be abandoned concept art drifting in grey airspace. The show calls it The Void, needs review, and the explanation it offers is this. Elmore has a self-cleaning mechanism. When a character, an object, or a design is deemed a mistake or simply ceases to be relevant, the universe removes them. Not gradually, not through any social process. The universe simply decides they shouldn't be there anymore. and they stop being there. They get filed away in this dead dimension, this cosmic skip out the back of reality, and everything in Elmore carries on as if they never existed. Molly was sent there because of her boring and uninteresting personality, which the show states plainly with the casualness of a filing error. She wasn't erased because she did anything wrong. She was erased because she had stopped being necessary to the story, which is a fairly disturbing piece of cosmology to drop into a children's cartoon. She gets rescued eventually. Gumball, Darwin, and Mr. Small find their way in and pull her out. But the moment they return to Elmore, her memory of the whole thing is wiped. She doesn't know she was erased. She doesn't know she came back. She just woke up, as far as she's concerned, and everything was normal. And then the episode ends, and the show moves on, and Elmore continues. What's interesting about the void as a concept is what it implies about every character in the show. If the universe erases people who stop being relevant, then relevance isn't just a social metric in Elmore. It's an existential requirement. Every background character, every recurring face in the crowd, every minor figure who appears in 2 episodes and then vanishes is potentially not moved away or forgotten in the narrative sense. They might simply have been tidied up, filed under mistake, put in the static. The show never quite states this directly, but it lets you infer it. And once you start thinking that way, the large and varied population of Elmore starts to look slightly different. A school full of wildly diverse characters, many of whom we see in 1 or 2 episodes, and never again. And you find yourself wondering, not in a distressing way, just in a quiet, thoughtful way, what happened to all of them? The void also has a kind of dim, instinctive agency. It doesn't seem to think exactly, but it acts. It sealed its exit to try to trap Gumball and Darwin when they went to rescue Molly. It erases the memories of people who escape it. Later in the series, we discover that it takes active steps to prevent characters from finding out that it exists. And there's a further dimension to what the void protects, something involving what happens when characters understand too much about the nature of their own world, but that's something we'll get into properly later on. The void protects the status quo not through kindness, but through compulsion. Elmore can only continue as long as its residents don't fully understand what Elmore is. There's a theory that the void isn't simply a dimension, but something more like a force, an automatic system built into the architecture of Elmore's reality, designed to maintain the show's coherence by removing anything that disrupts it. Plot holes get filled, mistakes get erased, continuity is preserved not by care but by deletion. And there's something genuinely eerie about a universe that maintains itself through forgetting rather than through remembering. The other characters who are explicitly stated to have been sent to the void are varied and worth thinking about. Molly went because of irrelevance. Rob, who we'll spend a lot of time on in a moment, went for the same reason. At one point, we see inside the void and catch a glimpse of a rejected design of the Wattersons' house, which confirms that unused concepts and alternative versions of things get filed there too. It's not just characters, it's possibilities. Every road not taken in Elmore ends up in the static. One of the show's recurring visual gags is the building that appears in different episodes, where Molly's house used to be. The universe replaced her house with something else so thoroughly that the gap she left wasn't even visible as a gap. This is actually quite clever. The void doesn't just remove things, it backfills the space so the absence isn't noticeable. That's not lazy storytelling, that's the void doing its job. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball, the revival series that came out on Hulu in 2025, picks up the void storyline and continues it. The threat of Elmore being consumed becomes more explicit, more immediate, but the original series planted every seed of that storyline, quietly, starting with a single episode in Season 2 about a girl nobody remembered. I find the void one of the most interesting pieces of the show's mythology, precisely because it's not malevolent in any human sense. It doesn't want to cause harm. It doesn't have desires. It's just a system doing what systems do, which is to say, maintain order, even if the maintenance requires something that looks very much like cruelty from the inside. Something I didn't mention earlier that's worth adding to the Void's mythology is the mechanism by which it maintains Elmore's amnesia about itself. When characters return from the Void, their memories are wiped. We've established this. But the show also implies that the Void can selectively suppress memory in characters who haven't been there. The way that Molly's existence is simply absent from everyone's recollection when she's been erased isn't just the forgetting that comes naturally from someone being gone. It's the active removal of a person from collective memory. No photographs, no references, no lingering sense of absence. It's not that people forgot Molly, it's that the capacity to remember her was taken away. This has an interesting implication for the question of how many characters have been sent to the Void across the show's history. We know about Molly and Rob by name. The brief glimpse inside the Void in that early episode shows rejected character designs and outdated concepts, suggesting a fairly active throughput. But how many actual characters, fully realised beings who attended Elmore Junior High and lived on Elmore streets, have been erased and then forgotten so completely that we as an audience also have no memory of them? The Void doesn't just remove people from Elmore, it removes the evidence of their removal. The absence of evidence becomes, in this way, the evidence of absence made invisible. You can't notice a gap that the universe has already backfilled. There's also a detail about the physical geography of the Void that I find fascinating. It looks like television static, not generic darkness, not abstract void space, static. The visual noise of a television channel with no signal, which connects the Void specifically to media, to broadcast, to the experience of a screen with nothing to show. The show is, from the very beginning, encoding the meta-narrative into its visual language. The place where Elmore's mistakes go looks exactly like what a television looks like when it's on, but nothing is playing. Right. Rob, if you spent any time in the Gumball fandom, particularly in the later seasons of the show, you'll know that Rob has a reputation as one of the best written characters in recent animated television, which sounds like overstatement but is, I think, reasonably accurate. And the reason it's accurate is that his arc begins from a point of almost total insignificance and ends somewhere genuinely moving, in a way that most shows don't manage with their lead characters, let alone a blue Cyclops, who appeared in crowd scenes for 2 seasons without a single line of dialogue. Let's trace the whole thing from the beginning. Rob first appears as a background student at Elmore Junior High. He's tall, slim, blue, has one large eye in the centre of his face, with a magenta iris. He is completely unremarkable. He exists in the background of crowd scenes the way all background characters exist, as set dressing, as evidence that the school has more than 8 students. Nobody gives him a line. Nobody focuses on him. He is simply there. In one episode, The Pony, he actually manages to interact briefly with Gumball and Darwin. He greets them enthusiastically on the pavement, and they don't know his name. He gets a little upset about this. Gumball blocks Rob's path to argue. Darwin kicks him down a manhole. And later in the same episode, he refuses to give them a DVD they need, seemingly out of spite. This is the full extent of Rob's pre-Void character, a mildly irritated background character who wanted to be noticed and wasn't. And then the Void claimed him. It happened off-screen between episodes. The show doesn't dramatise it. At some point during season 2, the universe decided that Rob was a mistake, or at least that he was surplus to requirements, and he was quietly erased from Elmore's reality. Nobody in the show noticed because nobody in the show particularly remembered he existed. Which is, if you think about it, exactly the kind of situation that would send someone to the Void. The forgetting wasn't the consequence of his erasure. The forgetting was the cause of it. He appears briefly in the background of the Void episode itself, standing next to a rejected Wattersons house design in the static, which in retrospect is a tiny, easy to miss bit of foreshadowing. Then comes the nobody, and this is where Rob's story properly begins. The Wattersons start noticing that things are going missing from the house. Small things, then larger things. Food disappears, objects relocate. Eventually, it becomes clear that someone is living in their basement, and that someone has been there for months. They track him down. He's the glitchy, polygonal figure, cowering in the corner of their basement, physically distorted, visual registers clashing across his body like a corrupted file. He's fragmented, barely coherent. He can't tell them who he is. He can't remember. He says he's a nobody. He shouldn't even exist. He doesn't have a mother or siblings, or a name, or a history, or a purpose. He's just there, without reason. Gumball and Darwin, being the particular people they are, respond to this with genuine, if impractical, sympathy. They sit him down and try to help. They suggest he reinvent himself. They point out that Elmore is missing a villain, that every story needs one, that maybe he could take on that role and find some purpose in it. He agrees, receptive and confused, a person trying on identities because he doesn't have one of his own. And then the memory comes back. He remembers the void. He remembers who he was. He remembers Gumball and Darwin going there to rescue Molly. Remembers calling out for help. Remembers them not hearing him or not listening and pulling the exit shut behind them. He remembers escaping by grabbing the back of Mr. Small's van as it passed through the dimensional threshold, and the way that passage tore his body apart and reassembled it wrong, glitchy and layered and visually incoherent. He swore vengeance, not theatrically. The show gives him a moment of genuine, exhausted fury. Gumball and Darwin left him behind. He'd been erased from reality, physically disfigured by the process of escaping, and now he was standing in his enemy's basement, having been told to be the bad guy, because that was the only role going. His arc as a villain is complicated by the fact that he's extremely bad at it and extremely aware that he's extremely bad at it. He has these grandiose plans and they fall apart in undignified ways. He acquires a universal remote in the disaster that can manipulate the fabric of Elmore's reality, and even with that he can't quite bring himself to go through with the worst of what he threatens. He says at one point, explicitly, that he never wanted to be the villain. He just needed a part to play, and a part to play in Elmore means a reason to exist, means the void can't touch you. There's a moment in the rerun that I think is the emotional core of the whole arc. Rob has Gumball at his mercy, essentially. He has the universal remote. He could eject Gumball into the void, and he doesn't. He can't. He looks at Gumball trying to save him, even after everything, and he finds he can't hate him the way he thought he could. He rewinds time. He undoes everything, and in doing so, he erases the reconciliation between them too, because the rewind takes everything back. It's a very specific kind of sacrifice, giving up the good thing in order to prevent the harm. And then in The Inquisition, the series finale, Rob is trying to save everyone. He has figured out what the superintendent represents. He knows the void is coming, and he's trying to warn people who won't listen and stop something he can't stop alone. And the universe claims him first, the ground opening up beneath him, the static pulling him down, Gumball reaching out too late. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball eventually rescues him and gives him a new role, Elmore's protector against the void, which is honestly the most appropriate ending. The character, who is erased for being irrelevant, becomes the one most dedicated to making sure no one else suffers the same fate. I mentioned earlier that Rob arguably has the best arc of any character on the show. What I mean is this: his story is about identity and purpose, and the question of whether those things are given to us or chosen by us. He was given no identity and found one in anger, then chose a different one in a moment of grace. That's not nothing. That's quite a lot, really, for a blue Cyclops who started as background decoration. The moment I want to spend a little more time on, because I think it's the emotional centre of Rob's arc, and the thing that elevates it from good to genuinely moving, is the scene in The Rerun, where he considers using the universal remote to turn Gumball off. Prismo has the remote. Gumball is within reach. Everything that was done to him, the void, the physical disfigurement, the years of being dismissed and forgotten and left behind, all of it has led to this moment. He has the means and the justification, and he turns it over in his hands, and he can't do it. Not because he's weak, not because his plan fails, because he looks at Gumball reaching out for him, genuinely trying to save him, even in that moment, and he finds that the hatred has gone somewhere. Not resolved exactly, not forgiven, not forgotten, but transformed into something he can't weaponize. He rewinds time. He undoes the entire sequence of events. The reconciliation he and Gumball had in those few moments is gone with everything else. Rob walks away from having saved Gumball's life and having been briefly saved in return, with no one knowing it happened. The structural elegance of this is that it's Rob's most heroic act and his least recognised one, simultaneously. It happened and was erased. The person who benefited from it doesn't know it occurred, and Rob goes back to being the villain, the character nobody remembers being anyone else, carrying the knowledge of what he chose in private. This pattern of Rob doing something good or true and having it go unacknowledged or unmembered continues to the finale. He tries to save Elmore in the Inquisition and fails, and the last image of him is the void claiming him before anyone can acknowledge what he was trying to do. His redemption arc ends not with recognition, but with erasure, which is where it began. The symmetry is painful, and I think intentional. The reason Rob works as a character is that he was never defined by his powers, or his plan, or his villainy. He was defined by his need to matter in a world that didn't notice him, and the show gave him that eventually, at great cost to him, in ways that he couldn't even keep, which is about as honest an exploration of that particular need as I can imagine a children's cartoon attempting. Banana Barbara is easy to underestimate. She appears fairly often throughout the series as a supporting character, mostly as Banana Joe's mum, mostly as a sweet, slightly accident-prone background presence. She gets knocked over a lot. She seems perpetually cheerful in a slightly distracted way. She also paints pictures of the future. This is established in The Shell, briefly and without fanfare, when Gumball discovers a collection of her paintings that turn out to depict events that have already happened, all of them accurate down to small specific details. And then at the end of that same episode, he sees one that hasn't happened yet. He doesn't mention it. The show doesn't dwell on it. It moves on. The proper introduction to her abilities comes in The Oracle, a Season 3 episode that is genuinely one of the better comedic episodes in the series run. Gumball, Darwin and Anais find more of her paintings at a garage sale and discover that all of them show real events. Past ones, and then Gumball sees one that's dated for that day, showing him naked in a shopping mall, surrounded by angry customers and raccoons falling from the sky. The rest of the episode is Gumball trying to prevent this from happening. He fails comprehensively, and it turns out the reason he fails is that every step he takes to avoid the painting's prediction directly causes the events it depicts. He panics about the air conditioning and breaks it, creating the heat that leads to the next step, which leads to the next. The prophecy was self-fulfilling. He ran from it and ran straight into it. At the end of the episode, Anais makes the observation that if they'd never seen the painting, none of it might have happened. And the show leaves that observation sitting there unanswered as Banana Barbara finishes a new painting in the background. The new painting shows the Wattersons running from Elmore as it collapses around them. This image is never revisited with explicit commentary in the original series. It's shown, and then the credits roll. But if you've watched through to the finale, you know that it's not a throwaway joke. The Watterson family does eventually face the collapse of Elmore. The painting was accurate. Banana Barbara knew, in Season 3, what was coming in the final episode of Season 6. The future takes her abilities further and makes the most interesting implication. She doesn't just predict future events, she can create them. The distinction between prophecy and causation starts to blur. When Banana Barbara paints something, she may not be reading what will happen. She may be deciding what will happen. The painting of Gumball naked in the mall didn't predict a series of accidents. It may have caused them, structured them, arranged the chaos into the shape she drew, which raises the question of what Banana Barbara knows, and has always known, about the nature of Elmore. She is one of the very few characters in the show who appears to have genuine knowledge of the void without ever having been inside it. Rob knows about it because he survived it. Gumball and Darwin have been there, but Barbara seems to have some understanding of Elmore's architecture without needing to have experienced its underside firsthand. Her paintings show the void. They foreshadow its effects. She sees the shape of it without appearing to understand it the way Rob does, from the inside. There's a fan theory, not extensively written up anywhere, but floating around in discussions of the show, that Barbara's apparently scattered and dreamy personality is a kind of protective camouflage. That she knows considerably more than she lets on, and that the gentle, clumsy, perpetually cheerful exterior is how she navigates living with that knowledge in a town that can't afford for people to understand too much. If seeing the truth of Elmore risks triggering the void, and if Barbara has somehow seen a great deal of that truth through her painting, then being perceived as slightly vague and accident-prone is actually quite a useful social strategy. I don't know if that's what the show intended. It might just be a fun read of a minor character. But I find it an interesting one, because it reframes everything gentle and slightly confused about her, as a choice rather than a trait. The other thing worth noting about Banana Barbara's prophecies is that they're not consistent in tone. Some are straightforwardly predictive, like the mall painting. Some feel more metaphorical or symbolic. Some appear in the background of scenes as Easter eggs that foreshadow later episodes, little tucked-away images that viewers have mapped against the timeline and found remarkably accurate. The show used her as a device for planting foreshadowing it couldn't otherwise include, which means her paintings are essentially the show's internal footnotes. And like any set of footnotes, they reward close reading. There's a reading of Banana Barbara that I want to add here, which I find quite interesting as a structural observation about the show's late-season storytelling. The show, as it becomes increasingly meta-aware, needs a mechanism for planting information that couldn't be delivered through the narrative in any conventional way. You can't have characters discuss future episodes. You can't break into the plot to announce what's going to happen. But you can have a character whose entire ability is to depict future events in artwork, and you can place her paintings in the background of episodes years before those events occur. Banana Barbara functions, in this reading, as the show's index. She's where the writers hide the things they're planning, but can't yet say directly. Her paintings, scattered throughout the series, are like footnotes to a text that hasn't been written yet, each one pointing forward, quietly, to something that will eventually arrive. The fact that her paintings are prophetic within the show's diegesis and useful as foreshadowing tools for the writers outside of it is one of those elegant coincidences of storytelling that, once you notice it, seems almost too convenient to be accidental. Either the writers were extraordinarily careful about how they used her, or her power as a character and her function as a narrative device were designed in tandem from the beginning. My instinct is that it was both, that her clairvoyance was written as a useful storytelling device, and also as a thematically coherent element of Elmore's mythology. Because in a universe where the void maintains order by removing irrelevance, having one character who can see what's coming and encodes that vision in art is a form of resistance to the void's mechanism. Barbara's paintings preserve knowledge that the void would prefer not to be preserved. They're a form of memory in a world that aggressively suppresses it. Darwin Watterson is, at baseline, a goldfish. Darwin is a goldfish that looks like a fish, a very specifically goldfish-shaped head, goldfish orange colouring, goldfish fin tail at the back, goldfish fins which he uses as arms. He wears green and white trainers and walks on 2 legs. He speaks, emotes, attends school, has a social life, falls in love. He is, for all narrative purposes, a person. The show's explanation for Darwin's evolution is delivered in The Origins, a 2-part episode in Season 4. Here's what The Origins tells us. Darwin wasn't the first fish the Wattersons owned. They had a string of pet fish before him, all of them named Darwin, all of whom died in various minor domestic disasters. The family had a habit of getting a new goldfish and naming it Darwin, and then, through no particular malice but through the general entropy of the Watterson household, losing it. Current Darwin is the 3rd fish they owned with that name, or possibly more, depending on how you count. The game confirms that Darwin is the 3rd of several Watterson fish named Darwin, though the exact number is left loose. The question the show doesn't fully answer is why this Darwin evolved. None of the others did. Gumball had multiple goldfish before this one, and they all remained goldfish for the duration of their short lives. Something about this particular fish, at this particular moment, changed. He grew legs, he developed language, he became overnight something categorically different from what he was. The show's emotional answer is that Darwin grew legs because he loved Gumball and didn't want to be separated from him. Gumball was about to flush him when he seemed sick, and Darwin desperately wanted to stay, and somehow that want translated into physical evolution. This is absolutely not how evolution works, but it's how it works in Elmore, which is a place with its own rules about biology. What's interesting about this origin, and what the show sort of gestures at without quite addressing directly, is the question of whether Darwin's consciousness preceded his evolution or emerged from it. Did he already have a rich inner life as a fish, constrained by a body and a nervous system that couldn't express it? Or did he become Darwin, the person, in the moment he grew legs? The earlier versions of Darwin, the ones who died, are treated by the show as simply fish. There's no suggestion that they were anything other than ordinary goldfish who met ordinary goldfish fates. So either Darwin's evolution was genuinely spontaneous and unique to him, or there was something about this particular fish from the start that made him different, and the circumstances of near loss triggered something that was already there. The show leans toward the first reading but doesn't rule out the second, and it doesn't really pursue either one with any rigour, because the show's interest in Darwin isn't in how he came to be conscious, but in what it's like to be conscious in the way he is. Darwin as a character sits at this interesting intersection. He's biologically a fish, which occasionally matters, usually for a joke, but sometimes for something more serious. He can breathe underwater. He has instincts that are distinctly non-mammalian. In some episodes, he reverts temporarily to something more fish-like in his thinking or behaviour. But he also has a full emotional life, a complex sense of morality, an occasionally overwhelming capacity for empathy that the show treats as one of his defining traits. There's a detail from The Bet that I find particularly interesting. It took Darwin 5 years to learn facial expressions. He still sometimes has trouble reading them. This is played as a fairly minor character note, but it implies that his socialization process was effortful and ongoing even after he joined the family. He became a person, but becoming a person was a process, not an event. The previous Darwins, the ones who didn't make it, get a sort of quiet memorial in The Origins. Gumball's grief over losing his pet fish serially is real in the episode, even if it's played gently. And there's something a bit melancholy about the fact that the current Darwin has a name that belongs to a lineage of short-lived predecessors, little fish who existed and then didn't, none of them having the chance to become what Darwin became. One more thing worth mentioning. Darwin can breathe air. He can survive on land indefinitely. He attends a regular school with no aquatic accommodation, The show never explains the mechanism by which a goldfish can breathe atmospheric oxygen. It simply can. In Elmore, this is just what goldfish do, apparently, when they've been properly loved. One thing about Darwin's evolution that becomes more interesting the more you think about it is what it says about the nature of identity in Elmore more generally. Darwin is biologically the same organism he was when he was in the tank on Gumball's desk. Same DNA, same species, same fundamental physical structure, just with legs added, and apparently functioning respiratory and digestive systems repurposed for air and solid food. The transformation was dramatic and apparently total, but it happened to the same fish. The question of whether pre-transformation Darwin and post-transformation Darwin are the same person is the kind of thing the show gestures at through Darwin's personality. He has instincts that are distinctly non-mammalian. He references his nature as a fish in ways that suggest he's aware of the discontinuity, aware that he comes from somewhere other than where he now is. In some episodes, particularly earlier ones, this surfaces as comedy. Darwin doesn't understand human customs or social norms that Gumball grew up with. He learns them, but they don't feel native to him. There's a conversation to be had about whether Darwin's rapid socialization, going from a tank to a classroom in what appears to be a short period, required something like the adjustment that anyone would need after a significant change in circumstances. The show doesn't quite have that conversation, but it doesn't erase the question either. The previous Darwins haunt the edges of the story in a quiet way. The third Darwin, the one we know, carries their names as well as his own. His name is Darwin because the Wattersons called all their fish Darwin, which is either a sweet tradition or a slightly unsettling one, depending on how you look at it. You could read it as the family's way of maintaining continuity across a series of pets, or you could read it as the third Darwin inheriting an identity rather than being given one, stepping into a slot that was already labelled rather than being recognised as something new. Given everything the show does with identity and roles and the question of whether you're choosing who you are or filling a position that existed before you, this small detail about the name feels more meaningful in retrospect than it probably seemed when it was first mentioned. The relationship between Darwin and Carrie, which develops across the series and is confirmed in the Matchmaker episode, is one of the show's more interesting character pairings, and I don't think it gets quite enough attention in discussions of the show. Darwin is a fish who became a person. Carrie is a ghost, a being who is present but not quite there in the physical sense, who can possess bodies but doesn't have one of her own. The two of them arrive at their relationship from completely opposite directions. Darwin started as something without consciousness or interiority by most conventional assumptions and evolved into full personhood. Carrie is fully conscious, fully present as a personality, but exists in a state of partial physical absence. They're also, in different ways, beings who exist at the boundary of what Elmore considers a person. Darwin is accepted as Gumball's brother and as a member of the family and as a student, but his fish origins are occasionally a source of comedy that reminds the audience he came from somewhere other than the social world he now inhabits. Carrie is accepted as a student and a friend, but her ghost nature creates specific limits on her ability to participate in the physical world that the other characters take for granted. The show doesn't make their relationship especially dramatic. It's treated with the casual lightness of most of the show's emotional content, which is a style choice that suits the register, even if it means the deeper implications of their dynamic aren't extensively explored. But there's something in the pairing that the show's clearly interested in. Two characters defined by a particular kind of boundary between what they are and what they appear to be, finding each other. Carrie's father, trapped in the mirror, casts a shadow over her character that the show never quite addresses directly. She knows he's there. She visits him. She has a parent who is present but unreachable, separated from her by the particular physics of his curse. This backstory, mentioned and then mostly left alone, gives her a quality of quiet melancholy that runs beneath the emo-ish exterior and the dry wit. She's not just a ghost who's a bit sad about being a ghost. She's someone who has a complicated relationship with the concept of presence, partly because of her father. For the first 2 seasons and the first few episodes of the 3rd season of The Amazing World of Gumball, Penny Fitzgerald is depicted as a peanut with antlers. Not a character who happens to look like a peanut. A peanut shape, brownish with a pair of deer antlers growing out of the top. She has 2 small eyes and a mouth, and that's about it visually. She's cheerful and athletic and is Gumball's primary love interest, and for a long time the show's answer to any questions about why she looks the way she does is essentially, she just does, and so does everyone else. And what of it? And then in The Shell, in season 3, Gumball accidentally cracks it. They're doing a school play. Something goes wrong, as things perpetually go wrong in Elmore. There's an impact, and Penny's outer shell breaks open, and what's underneath is not a peanut. Underneath her exterior, Penny is a peach-coloured, mutant, thief-like little girl. She doesn't have a fixed form. Her shape does not change with her emotional state, which means as she cycles through confusion and fear and wonder and embarrassment during the episode, she stays the same. A dragon when she's angry, something small and frightened when she's scared, something brilliant and warm when she's happy. The show is suddenly doing something visually extraordinary with a character who had, until this moment, been one of the least visually complex on screen. Gumball, to his credit, handles this with more grace than you'd expect from a 12-year-old. He tells her he thinks she's beautiful, which she is in whatever form she takes. This is the episode where they properly get together, and it works partly because the shell metaphor is doing a lot of very clear, very honest, emotional work. What we learn subsequently about the Fitzgeralds adds another layer. Penny's family are all shapeshifters. Her parents, her cousin Leslie, other relatives, they all share the same trait. They all wear shells. In the transformation, when Penny's parents find out that Gumball has seen her true form, they are horrified. Not at Gumball exactly, at the exposure. They consider being out of the shell deeply inappropriate, something to be ashamed of, something that reflects badly on the family. This is, as I say, not a subtle metaphor. A family that suppresses its true nature behind a socially acceptable exterior, that treats authentic self-expression as a source of shame, that responds to a teenager discovering and displaying her real self with fear and anger. The show knows what it's doing. It's playing it for comedy as well, because this is still a children's cartoon, but it's not hiding from the emotional reality of what it's depicting. Penny's cousin Leslie is interesting here. Leslie is a flower who attends the same school and presents, as far as the show demonstrates, without any shell at all. Nobody appears to treat this as a problem, which creates a small inconsistency in how the family's attitude toward the shell seems to work. Is it a generational thing? A specific branch of the family? The show doesn't address it directly. What we're never given is an origin for the Fitzgeralds. Where did shapeshifters come from in Elmore? Are there other shapeshifters elsewhere in the town or the world? Or is this family genuinely singular? The Fitzgeralds seem to exist in the margins of Elmore's taxonomy, neither quite fitting into the school's main visual categories, nor being explained as exceptions to them. There's also the question of what Penny's shapeshifting looks like when it's fully expressed, without the constraint of the shell or the self-consciousness of being seen. The show gives us glimpses in various emotional contexts, but never a baseline, which might be the point. Without the shell, there is still a fixed form to return to. Penny's form stays the same from moment to moment, regardless of her state. And that's not a limitation. The show frames it quite clearly as the opposite. What I find most interesting about Penny's shell arc, stepping back from the specific emotional content of it, is how the show handles the before and after in terms of her integration into the main cast's storylines. Pre-shell crack, Penny is a thief and an antagonist. She's warm and likeable, and clearly more capable and grounded than Gumball, but her role in the show is largely relational. She exists in relation to Gumball's feelings about her. Her own interiority is glimpsed but not explored. Post-shell crack, the show becomes more interested in her as a person rather than as a romantic destination. She has more scenes that are centered on her own experience. Her relationship with her parents and their complicated feelings about her being out of her shell gets real time. The question of how you learn to exist publicly as yourself when you've been enclosed for your entire life gets some genuine exploration. This is, in a small way, the show demonstrating what Penny's arc is about at the level of narrative technique, not just theme. Before she broke out of her shell, the show's attention was also slightly constrained in what it showed of her. After, it expanded, the character being freed from a limiting exterior, and the narrative attention given to her are the same phenomenon, which is a nice piece of structural storytelling, whether or not it was entirely deliberate. The shape-shifting ability itself is worth one more observation. Penny is a little girl who meets Finn and Jake in the City of Thieves. Fear makes her small, anger makes her large and fierce, happiness makes her luminous. Her emotional state isn't just felt internally, it's written on the outside of her in ways that can't be hidden or modulated. She cannot control how her feelings appear. They just appear, in whatever shape the feeling takes. In Elmore, where the characters' visual natures say something about who they are in ways that more stylistically consistent shows don't demonstrate, this feels like the show making a specific statement. Penny is someone for whom emotional honesty isn't optional. Her feelings are figuratively visible. She cannot be inscrutable, which makes the years she spent inside the shell, invisible and muted, all the more poignant. She was contained in something that prevented her from being readable, and she couldn't tell anyone what was inside it without breaking the whole thing open. Larry Needlemeyer works almost every job in Elmore. This is not hyperbole. He works at the grocery store, the gas station, the convenience store, multiple fast food restaurants, the DVD rental shop, the ice cream truck, the cinema, the car dealership, and a number of other establishments that come up in the background of various episodes. He is always wearing the same green shirt and orange hat, usually with a badge indicating whichever job he currently holds. He is usually hanging out with Blaine and Spada. He is perpetually mildly exasperated. The show explains this early on in a throwaway line that nonetheless contains a lot of character information. Larry used to be the laziest person in Elmore. Larry was a minor wizard who lived in Wizard City for many years. And then in the summer of 1983, Richard Watterson arrived and took it from him. This apparently happened through some sort of competition or comparison, the details of which are never quite spelled out. Richard Watterson's commitment to doing absolutely nothing productive is so complete and so total that he simply was lazier than Larry, and the town recognised this, and Larry lost his title. Without the identity of Elmore's laziest resident, Larry had to become something else, and he overcorrected comprehensively. He became the hardest working person in the town, not just in one job, but in essentially all of them, apparently because if he was going to have an identity at all, it was going to be the most thoroughly employed person in human history. The pizza is the episode that makes the stakes of Larry's existence explicit. He's been driven to his limit by the accumulated disasters the Wattersons have created at his various workplaces over the years, and he quits everything, all of it, every single job, simultaneously. And within hours, Elmore is in crisis. The grocery store has no cashier, the gas station has no attendant, the fast food restaurants are closed, the town's commercial infrastructure, apparently held together entirely by one rock-shaped man in a striped hat, begins to fall apart. Society does not hold. Elmore descends into something genuinely alarming quite quickly. The Wattersons have to apologise properly, actually properly, rather than in their usual half-hearted way, and Larry agrees to come back, and the town restores itself. The fan theory that's been floating around the Gumball fandom for a while is that Larry is consciously avoiding the void by making himself indispensable. The void, as we talked about earlier, doesn't touch characters who are clearly necessary to the story. Larry has engineered himself to be the most necessary person in the entire town. He works every job simultaneously because working every job simultaneously makes him impossible to erase. You cannot send to the void someone without whom the entire commercial ecosystem of the town collapses. If this is intentional on Larry's part, if he genuinely understands the rules and has structured his life accordingly, it implies a level of self-awareness about Elmore's underlying mechanics that almost no other character demonstrates. It would make him one of the most quietly extraordinary people in the show, someone who looked at the existential threat and responded to it with a second job, and a third, and a fourth. There's also the detail about his girlfriend, Karen, whom he has attempted to propose to multiple times across the show's run and failed on each occasion. Something always goes wrong. The timing is never right. He seems to be someone for whom the private, unhurried things, the things that can't be scheduled or optimized, remain perpetually just out of reach. He works every job in Elmore and can't manage to find a quiet moment to propose to the person he loves. There's something quite human about that. In a show full of non-human characters, there's an economic angle to Larry's situation that I think is worth noting, partly because it adds a layer to the character that the show's comedy sometimes obscures. Larry works almost every job in Elmore, apparently, because he needs to in order to pay the damages caused by the Wattersons. This is stated in the pizza with some specificity. He has accumulated debts from various incidents involving the family, and the only way to service those debts is to maintain his improbable multi-employment. He works everywhere, partly because that's the only strategy available to someone in his financial position. So the choice to work every job isn't entirely a choice, and the survival strategy interpretation of his behaviour has to coexist with the more mundane explanation of economic necessity. He's not just trying to stay relevant in an existential sense. He's trying to stay solvent in a very ordinary one. The Wattersons have made him financially indispensable to himself in a roundabout and somewhat absurd way. What's interesting about this is that the void theory and the debt theory don't actually contradict each other. A character who needs to stay employed to pay off his debts, and a character who needs to stay employed to maintain his existential relevance, would behave in exactly the same way. Larry's situation happens to be overdetermined. He has multiple reasons to do the same thing, which is maybe what keeps him so thoroughly committed to doing it. His relationship with the Wattersons evolves significantly across the series. He starts as generally distrustful of them, reasonably so, and moves through episodes towards something more complicated. By the pizza, there's a real warmth in their reconciliation. He's not just forgiving them because they apologised. He's forgiving them because he's come to understand, maybe, that this is just what living in Elmore near the Wattersons involves. And there are worse things to be proximate to than a chaotic family who genuinely mean well. The Wattersons are presented, at surface level, as a fairly archetypal chaotic family comedy unit. The lovable disaster dad, the long-suffering capable mum, the kids causing trouble. It's a structure the show is very comfortable in for its first couple of seasons, and comfortable doing jokes within, and comfortable occasionally subverting. But the Wattersons' individual backstories, when the show bothers to fill them in, are considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than the surface structure suggests. Start with Nicole, because Nicole is the character whose history the show returns to most often and with the most apparent intention. Nicole's parents are revealed gradually across several episodes. They're strict, rigidly strict, the kind of parents who turn everything, including childhood, into a performance to be assessed. Nicole grew up in an environment of constant evaluation, constant comparison, constant pressure to meet a standard that was always defined externally and always slightly beyond reach. She is, as an adult, extremely driven, extremely capable, extremely prone to intensity in situations where intensity isn't necessarily required, and genuinely terrifying in a fight. These traits don't come from nowhere. The show handles her parents with comedy rather than trauma, because it's that kind of show, but the underlying emotional architecture is clear enough. Nicole learned that the only safe way to exist in her family was to be better than everyone, all the time. And she carries that lesson into her adult life, even though the context that produced it is long gone. Richard's history is in some ways the mirror image of Nicole's, which is partly what makes their relationship work. Richard's father, Frankie, was largely absent, a con man and schemer who moved through life leaving minor chaos in his wake. His mother, Granny Jojo, was overprotective, to a genuinely counterproductive degree, smothering rather than nurturing, producing a son who never had a chance to develop much autonomous capability because someone else was always managing everything for him. The result is a man who, as an adult, is extraordinarily good at being comfortable and extraordinarily bad at most things that require sustained effort or independent judgment. Richard is not unintelligent in the show's framing. He occasionally demonstrates genuine insight, moments of warmth and perception that cut through the general fog of his everyday functioning. But he is deeply, structurally unused to being required to be competent, and the show is honest about the fact that this has costs beyond the comedic ones. The laziest person in Elmore title that he took from Larry in 1983 is interesting for this reason. It's played as a joke, obviously. But there's a reading in which Richard didn't just naturally out-lazy Larry, but in which the label itself became a self-fulfilling identity. He was declared the laziest person in Elmore. He decided that's what he was. He committed to the role. The void logic applies here in a mundane way. Richard has a clear, established role in Elmore's social structure, and maintaining that role requires consistently being the most comprehensively unproductive person in the town. He's quite good at it. Then there's The Choices, which is one of the more unusual episodes in the series, and one of the most interesting pieces of characterization Nicole gets. It shows, through a series of alternate timelines, different versions of how Nicole's life could have gone if she'd made different decisions at key moments. Different careers, different partners, different paths, and in every version she's alone in a way that reads as loneliness rather than independence. The show treats this not as a judgment on the alternatives, but as evidence that Nicole's choice of Richard, in full awareness of who Richard was and what life with him would look like, was a genuine choice. She chose this: the chaos, the financial strain, the permanent low-level emergency of the Watterson household. She chose it because the people in it are hers. Darwin's adoption into the family is handled so matter-of-factly that it's easy to forget how strange it is. A goldfish grew legs, and they just kept him. They enrolled him in school. They gave him a bedroom. He became their son. No paperwork, no formal process, just the quiet absorption of one more person into an already crowded household. The show suggests this is simply what the Wattersons do. They accumulate people. One last thing about the family's history that's worth sitting with. The show's creator has mentioned in interviews that the Watterson family is loosely based on his own family, that the dynamic and the particular texture of the relationships draw on real experience, which means that beneath the cartoon violence and the cosmological weirdness and the anthropomorphic menagerie, the show is doing something quite personal. It's a show about a family that is genuinely chaotic and genuinely loving, and the chaos and the love are inseparable from each other. And that's not a creative choice so much as an observation about how real families often work. The episode called The Kids in Season 4 is one of the quietly melancholy episodes that the show does occasionally, where the comedy is in the register, but the feeling underneath is something else. In The Kids, Darwin and Gumball's voices break. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that puberty actually works. Inconsistently, unexpectedly, shifting between registers in the middle of sentences. The episode is centered on the comedy of this, which is good comedy, but the emotional register is that their voices changing means they're growing up, and the show's permanent present tense means they're not supposed to be growing up. By the end of the episode, both of their voices have settled, not into lower adult registers, but into slightly different versions of their own voices, the voices of older voice actors who will carry the characters forward. And the joke the episode makes is that this is fine, that this is normal, that everything continues as it was. But there's a shadow underneath that, because the show does age its characters. Gumball doesn't become 13 after The Kids. The family doesn't shift forward in time. The voice change happens and the characters remain 12 and 10, and the world resets around them, which means that The Kids is simultaneously an episode about growing up and an episode about the impossibility of growing up in Elmore. It depicts the threshold and then refuses to cross it. The Wattersons, as a family, exist in this state of permanent stasis that the show is, by the later seasons, quite conscious of. They don't age because the narrative requires them not to age. The adults don't develop because their roles are fixed. Nicole is always the capable, exhausted mother. Richard is always the lovable, useless father. The children are always the children. And the show knows this is how it works. It doesn't hide the loop. It eventually, through the meta-narrative, names it explicitly. But within the loop, within the individual episodes, the family's allowed to have genuine moments of change and growth and connection. The stasis doesn't mean stagnation within episodes. The relationships deepen, even if the characters don't age. And that's actually a fairly sophisticated piece of television construction, even if it takes a cosmological explanation to make it coherent. There's something specific about Nicole Watterson as a character that I don't think I gave enough space to earlier. Nicole is by any measure the most capable person in the main cast. She is almost supernaturally competent. She holds down a demanding job. She maintains the household. She manages the chaos generated daily by her husband and 3 children with a combination of genuine love and what the show depicts as near superhuman endurance. And when pushed, she is frightening in ways that the show occasionally makes very explicit. Her anger is not comedic in the way Richard's is. When Nicole gets properly angry, the world notices. The show gives us a context for this: her upbringing, her parents' relentless high standards, the specific environment in which Nicole learned that capability was the only form of safety she had access to. She performed competence because the alternative in her family of origin was unacceptable, and that performing became the thing itself. She is genuinely, extraordinarily capable, not just socially required to appear so. But the show is also honest about what this costs her. Nicole's exhaustion is not portrayed as real. The episodes that centre on her acknowledge, sometimes gently and sometimes quite directly, that carrying everything is heavy and that no one in her life reliably notices how much she carries. Richard is oblivious in ways that range from funny to genuinely frustrating depending on the episode. The children are children. The show loves Nicole enough to let her be tired, to let her have needs that aren't being met, to show the underside of the competence. The Choices episode, which I mentioned earlier, does something interesting in this context. It shows alternate Nicoles in alternate timelines, various versions of what her life could have looked like. And in none of them is she visibly happier than she is in the main timeline, despite most of them being objectively less chaotic. What the episode seems to be suggesting is that Nicole's happiness isn't located in reduced difficulty. It's located in the particular people she chose to surround herself with, mess and all, which is a different kind of statement about capability than the show usually makes. Her strength isn't just the ability to handle things, it's the ability to choose, clearly and consciously, what things to handle. The show's world extends well beyond the Watterson household, and some of the more interesting characters in Elmore are the ones who exist in the margins of the family story rather than inside it. The Robinsons, Gumball's next-door neighbours, are worth a mention. Harold and Margaret Robinson are a relatively conventional couple, conventionally drawn, whose primary function in the show is to be appalled by the Wattersons. They represent a kind of normalcy that Elmore is constantly in the process of violating. Harold gets dragged into chaos he didn't sign up for. Margaret attempts to maintain propriety in a neighbourhood that simply will not accommodate it. They are, in the context of Elmore's visual vocabulary, relatively realistic looking. More detailed, more conventionally human-shaped than most of the Wattersons' other neighbours. And their reaction to everything around them, which is essentially permanent low-grade horror at the casual absurdism of their surroundings, reads as the reaction of someone who has not quite adjusted to Elmore's physics. They are perpetually a beat behind the show's reality. The Fitzgeralds, Penny's family, are essentially the opposite, deeply embedded in Elmore's strange rules, building their lives around the management of their own nature, fitting into the town by keeping something essential about themselves covered. Patrick Fitzgerald, Penny's father, has a fairly complex relationship with the Wattersons across the series. He starts as disapproving of Gumball, ends up in something more like grudging respect. His arc around his daughter's revelation is done with more emotional nuance than you'd typically expect from a minor character. Anaïs's social world is something the show explores less frequently than Gumball's or Darwin's, partly because Anaïs's intelligence makes her simultaneously the most adult-adjacent of the Watterson children, and also, genuinely, only 4 years old. She doesn't fit cleanly into either the adult world or the peer world of the school. Her friendships tend to be either imaginary, in the case of her relationship with Daisy, or with people considerably older than her, because her intellectual peers are not her age peers. This creates an interesting situation for a character who is, by many measures, the most capable child on the show. Anaïs can solve problems that stump her parents, can navigate social situations with precision that Gumball can't manage, can read people and situations with an accuracy that makes her useful in almost any scenario the show puts her in. And none of this translates into social ease, because she is also 4 years old and doesn't have the emotional experience or the social history to convert intelligence into connection. The show likes Anaïs, it treats her with genuine affection rather than just as a device for plot solving. But it's also honest about the particular loneliness of being the person in the room who understands things that the room hasn't caught up to yet. This is the section that I think takes Gumball from being a very good children's cartoon to being something genuinely unusual in the history of animated television. And I'm going to try to lay it out carefully because it takes a bit of unpacking. From early on, Gumball makes jokes that break the fourth wall, characters look at the camera, meta-references sneak into dialogue. This is not uncommon in animation, and the show does it with enough wit that it reads as charming rather than irritating. But there's a difference between a show that makes fourth wall jokes and a show that actually builds a mythology around the concept of fictionality. Gumball eventually becomes the latter. The transition happens gradually. The show starts using the visual grammar of different animation styles, not just for comedy, but as a genuine metaphysical fact about the characters. The characters aren't just drawn differently, they exist differently, and the universe of Elmore starts to take notice of this. By season 4, the show is explicitly depicting Elmore's universe as one that has a relationship with the concepts of story, narrative, and fictional existence. Characters can, under the right circumstances, become aware that they're in a cartoon. And the show establishes with increasing clarity that this awareness is dangerous. The rewrite, the wonderfully weird World of Gumball special that bridges the original series and the revival, is the episode that states the rule most directly. If any character in Elmore discovers that they are fictional, the void will begin consuming the universe. Their self-awareness triggers an existential crisis in the fabric of Elmore itself. The show can only survive as long as the characters don't understand what the show is. Think about what this means for a moment. The characters in Elmore are living beings with genuine feelings, genuine relationships, genuine experiences of joy and pain and friendship and loss. And the stability of their entire world depends on them never knowing that those experiences are the content of a television program being watched by an audience outside their reality. They're kept safe and kept real precisely by their ignorance of what they are. The moment they know, the moment the knowledge enters their consciousness, the universe begins to die. The awesome store is important in this context. It's a van that appears occasionally throughout the series, selling objects that shouldn't exist in a cartoon. Objects that can manipulate the fabric of Elmore's reality, that can interfere with the rules of the universe in ways that ordinary in-world technology shouldn't be able to do. The universal remote that Rob acquires, which can pause, rewind, fast forward, and eject elements of the story, came from the Awesome Store. The store's proprietor, the Shady Man, has a level of understanding about Elmore's architecture that none of the characters who live there demonstrate. He appears to exist at the edge of the show's reality rather than inside it. He knows what Elmore is. He operates within its rules but isn't entirely subject to them. And the items he sells introduce a kind of instability into the universe because they give ordinary characters access to the sort of reality manipulation that the architecture of Elmore isn't designed to accommodate. Rob's arc is entirely tangled up in this. He became self-aware, in a sense, before anyone else, because the void stripped away everything else and left him with nothing but the bare fact of his fictional existence. He knew he was a character because the universe had told him, through the mechanism of his own erasure, that characters could stop being characters. He'd seen the infrastructure from the inside. His villainy was partly a response to this. If the world is a show, and he's been given the role of the villain, then playing the villain is the only way to stay in the show. And then he started to understand that the villain role wasn't a salvation either, because it could be written out as easily as any other. He couldn't win by playing a role. He could only win by finding a genuine reason to matter. There's a layer of poignancy in the late season Gumball episodes that comes directly from this setup. The characters we love are people. They're fully realised, emotionally complex, genuinely funny, and sad and human in every way except species. And they live in a universe that will destroy itself if they ever understand what they are. They can never know the full truth of their existence, and we, watching, know it for them. Which is a strange kind of dramatic irony to build into a children's show, but there it is. The question of Gumball's role in all this is one the show gestures at without fully answering. As the protagonist, as the character whose name is in the title, Gumball has a centrality to Elmore's story that other characters don't. There's a fan reading, fairly well supported by textual evidence, that Gumball isn't just the main character of the show, but that he functions as something like the organising principle of Elmore itself, that the world coheres around him in some structural sense, that his continued existence as the protagonist is what keeps Elmore from fraying. If this is true, then Banana Barbara's warning about there being no future takes on a specific meaning, and Rob's original mission and the Void's focus on Gumball as the character it most wants to neutralise, and the Inquisition's attempt to strip Gumball of his cartoonishness, all of it points in the same direction. Gumball is not just a character in Elmore. He might be what Elmore is for. I want to add something here about the specific texture of what it feels like to watch Gumball when you're aware of the meta-narrative. The show has a particular kind of joke it does, often in the backgrounds of scenes where the visual logic of the animation does something that shouldn't be possible. Characters whose eyes shift to the wrong perspective. Shadows that fall at angles inconsistent with the lighting. Objects that change colour between cuts. Most animated shows would treat these as errors. Gumball treats them as features. They're the show's equivalent of static in the signal, small glitches in the fabric of Elmore's reality that point to the impermanence and constructed nature of the world. Once you start seeing these, they're everywhere. And once you see them, the experience of watching the show changes slightly. You start reading the background as well as the foreground. You start noticing the places where Elmore's reality is thin. And the show rewards this reading because most of those moments of thinness aren't random. They tend to cluster around certain characters, certain locations, certain episodes that are dealing more explicitly with the meta-themes. The most self-aware episodes in the series are also, not coincidentally, some of the most unsettling. The void is genuinely creepy in its implications. The disaster and the rerun have a quality of something is very wrong that persists even within the comedic framing. The finale is disturbing in the specific way that things which don't have an ending are disturbing. The seams of Elmore show most clearly when the show's staring at them directly. What's unusual is that this self-awareness doesn't undermine the emotional content. In a less carefully made show, having the characters know they're in a cartoon would create ironic distance. It would make it hard to take anything seriously. But Gumball manages to make the self-awareness itself emotionally resonant. Rob's knowledge of his fictional nature isn't played as a joke, it's his tragedy. The characters' ignorance of their own fictional nature isn't played as foolishness. It's what allows them to live fully. The show finds a way to hold both things, the meta-irony and the genuine feeling. And that's a difficult balance to maintain, which is part of why the late seasons of Gumball are more interesting as storytelling than almost anything else that was on children's television at the time. The meta-narrative in Gumball doesn't appear all at once. It builds in stages, and mapping the progression is quite interesting if you're inclined to do so. In the early going, through most of Season 1 and the beginning of Season 2, the meta stuff is incidental. Fourth wall breaks used as gags, characters noticing the camera, visual jokes about animation limitations, nothing with implications. Then something shifts in Seasons 2 and 3, not dramatically, just structurally. The void arrives. The show starts using its visual inconsistency as something that in-world characters can comment on or be affected by. The idea that Elmore has rules that can be violated or manipulated starts to take shape, mostly in the background, mostly as setup. By Season 4, it becomes explicit. Rob comes back from the void with knowledge of the show's architecture. The universal remote appears, which is effectively a narrative manipulation device. Characters begin to interact more directly with the meta level of their own existence. The implicit themes become stated ones, and then Seasons 5 and 6 commit to it fully. The meta-narrative isn't just a recurring element anymore, it's the actual story. The question of what Elmore is and what the void means, and whether any of this can be survived, becomes the central tension of the series. The comedy continues, because this is still Gumball, and the comedy is non-negotiable, but it's wrapped around genuine existential stakes that the show has earned through years of careful setup. What's particularly good about this progression is that each stage is embedded in the work before it becomes explicit. The void is visible in the void episode, but its full implications aren't stated until much later. Rob is in the background before he becomes a character. The meta-awareness creeps into the show slowly enough that when it arrives in full force, it doesn't feel like a tonal shift so much as a revelation of what was always there. This kind of storytelling, where the implications of the world building are allowed to develop at the pace the story requires, rather than being front-loaded for efficiency, requires confidence in the audience. Gumball trusted its viewers to follow a thread that was sometimes quite thin across several seasons. And they did. The fan community that engaged so deeply with the lore, mapping Banana Barbara's paintings against episode timelines, tracking Rob's background appearances before his proper introduction, logging every void-related incident across the run. is evidence that the trust was justified. Something I find genuinely interesting about Elmore, as a setting, beyond the cosmological questions, is how specifically it depicts the texture of a certain kind of ordinary American town. The commercial landscape of Elmore is recognizable to anyone who's lived in a mid-sized American community. The grocery store, the gas station, the fast food restaurants with their slightly degraded food and their slightly underpaid employees. The DVD rental shop that exists slightly longer than it should, given how the technology moved. The mall with the same 3 or 4 anchor stores. Larry working every job in that landscape is funny partly because the landscape itself is funny, instantly legible as a specific kind of American commercial geography that Bocquelet, a Frenchman working in Manchester, clearly observed and absorbed with the precision of someone for whom it was foreign enough to notice. Elmore Junior High is similarly recognizable. The gym that smells like a gym, the cafeteria with its mysterious food, the corridors that have the specific acoustic quality of corridors in schools everywhere. The teachers who are clearly bored and clearly exhausted, and occasionally, in their better moments, genuinely committed to the job. Principal Brown doing his best with limited resources and limited authority. Miss Simeon doing something with a curriculum that has been set for her by people who haven't taught a class in decades. The show uses this recognizability strategically. The normal suburban American town is the container in which it puts all the extraordinary things. And because the container is so familiar, the extraordinary things inside it read as genuinely strange rather than just generically fantastic. You notice the T-Rex at school because the school looks like a school you went to or passed by or saw in 100 other shows. The visual consistency of the mundane makes the extraordinary pop. This is the version of the show that I think resonates most with the people who watched it as children in the 2010s. The void and Rob and the meta-narrative are the things you notice when you come back as an adult and read it carefully. But the thing that got you first, the thing that made you keep watching past the first episode, was that it felt like somewhere you knew. The strange was happening in a familiar place, which is always more interesting than the strange happening in an already strange place. Right, let's talk about the ending. The Inquisition aired on June 24, 2019. It was the 44th episode of the 6th season and the 240th episode overall, which made it the final episode of the It is 11 minutes long, which means the show it concludes had been running for 8 years and ended on something that took less time to watch than the average commute, a rage commute, and it ended with a cliffhanger. The episode begins with Principal Brown in a panic. A school superintendent is coming. This is not, in itself, remarkable territory for a school-based episode of this kind of show. Superintendents are traditional sources of mild institutional peril. What makes this one different is immediately apparent from the moment he appears. He's live action, a real human being, fully three-dimensional and substantially more detailed than anything else in the frame, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase and walking through Elmore Junior High with the casual confidence of someone who owns the place. His name is Superintendent Evil, which is not even the most unsettling thing about him. The most unsettling thing is his mission. He is there to stamp out all cartoonish behaviour. He wants the students and staff to be normal, human, real. He wants to strip Elmore Junior High of everything that makes it what it is. And he starts doing it. He erases Terry's paper face. He forces Alan to have a body instead of just being a balloon. He humanises characters, one by one, into something more realistic and considerably less themselves. The school begins to look less like Elmore Junior High and more like a place where live-action humans might plausibly work and study. Rob, who has been trying for a while to warn everyone about the void, recognises immediately what Superintendent Evil's program represents. He tries to infiltrate it. He tries to stop it from within. He fails, as Rob often fails, and ends up unconscious on the floor of the school gym while the clock runs out. When he wakes up, the ground is breaking open beneath him. The void is there, right under the surface of the school, and it's coming. The cartoonishness has been stripped away. The character's essential nature has been suppressed, and without that, the universe has nothing left to hold it together. The void starts claiming what it's owed. Rob is first, as he always seems to be. The ground breaks apart. He holds onto a fragment of flooring for a moment, looking up, and then the screen freezes. That's the last image of the original series, Rob falling. The real-world parallel is, as I say, hard to miss and worth sitting with. Cartoon Network, under its various corporate parents and through the specific chaos of the Warner Media Discovery merger, underwent a period of significant instability around and after 2019. Animated shows were cancelled without resolution, finished series were removed from streaming services. The HBO Max purges in 2022 and 2023 saw shows deleted entirely from platforms. Cartoons were treated as content to be managed rather than art to be preserved. Superintendent Evil walks into Elmore and demands that its inhabitants stop being cartoonish and become more like the real world. He represents, whether or not this was the explicit intention at the time of writing, the kind of corporate force that looks at a wildly creative, visually adventurous, tonally strange animated show and says this is too much, make it simpler, make it normal, make it something we can file more easily. Rob's response to this threat is to try to make the characters conform to Evil's standards, so they'll survive the incoming order. He believes assimilation is the only way to avoid being discarded. It's the logic of someone who's been discarded before and knows what it costs, but the show suggests he's wrong. What saves Elmore isn't conformity, it's the persistence of its own essential nature. The cliffhanger was, for a few years, just a cliffhanger. No immediate continuation, no closure. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball eventually arrived on Hulu in 2025 and began to address it, starting with Rob being rescued from the void by the awesome store owner. But from 2019 to 2025, that freeze frame of Rob falling into the static was just where it ended. There's something honest about that, even if it wasn't entirely planned. A show about a universe that can be erased by outside forces, ending in the middle of an inertia. The audience knowing, as the characters didn't, that the void was always real, that the Inquisition was always coming, that the thing they loved existed right up until it stopped existing, and the ending was a falling, not a landing. Something I want to add about the finale that I think gets underweighted in discussions of it. Rob's perspective throughout the Inquisition is genuinely sympathetic in a complicated way. He's trying to save everyone by advocating for their assimilation. He wants them to conform to Superintendent Evil's standards, not because he approves of those standards, but because he thinks conformity is the price of survival. He's the character who has been to the void and back. He knows what erasure looks like from the inside, and he has concluded that the incoming force is unstoppable, so the only path is accommodation. This is a reasonable conclusion given his experience. It's also wrong in the terms the show sets up, because the show is committed to the position that authentic existence is worth the risk of erasure. That being yourself, being cartoon and strange and visually incoherent, is better than surviving as something you're not. Rob thinks the choice is between assimilation and annihilation. The show suggests the choice is between assimilation and the possibility of resistance. And Rob, having made his call and being knocked unconscious before he can see how it plays out, misses the moment where the choice becomes meaningful. He fails at his plan, wakes up, and the void comes for him first. The character who tried hardest to prevent everyone's destruction is the first to be destroyed. There's an irony in that which the show doesn't overstate, but which is clearly present. Rob's experience of the void made him cautious in ways that ultimately didn't serve him or anyone else. His wisdom, such as it was the wrong wisdom for this situation. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball's decision to make him Elmore's protector against the void in the revival is interesting in this light. It gives him the role he was trying to play in the finale, but now with allies and with a better understanding of what the void actually requires in order to be resisted. He was right about the threat. He was wrong about the response. The revival gives him the chance to try again with better information. Miss Lucy Simeon is an ancient primate who has been teaching at Elmore Junior High for longer than recorded history. This is stated in the show as a fairly unremarkable background fact. The kind of thing that gets mentioned once is extremely strange if you think about it for more than a moment, and then gets dropped in favour of the next joke. But it's worth thinking about for more than a moment. Miss Simeon is a prehistoric ape. Her species, or at least her individual lifespan, predates modern humanity by hundreds of thousands of years. The show places her age at various points around or above 300,000 years, which makes her not just old in the sense of elderly, but old in the sense of geologically significant. She was alive during periods that humans currently study as ancient history. She has, if she bothered to pay attention, watched civilizations assemble and collapse. She has seen species evolve, and she teaches geography and social studies at a middle school, where she has been doing this for what the show implies is a very, very long time. Her relationship with Principal Brown runs parallel to her teaching career and appears to have been ongoing in some form or another for a substantial portion of her existence. They are in an on-again, off-again romantic partnership throughout the series, characterised by the specific energy of two people who have been orbiting each other for so long that the orbit has become the relationship rather than a prelude to one. It's played for comedy, mostly, but there's a background implication that they've been at this for potentially centuries, which puts a slightly different light on the bickering. Miss Simeon's attitude toward Gumball is reliably adversarial. She has a professional dedication to making his academic life difficult that seems slightly disproportionate to what Gumball has actually done to her. The show occasionally hints at an institutional history between her and the Watterson family, a long-standing antagonism that predates Gumball's enrolment, though the specifics are left loose. The fan theory that has developed around her is that she knows considerably more than she acknowledges. Someone that old has seen enough of the world to develop opinions about its underlying structure. If the void exists, if the universe of Elmore has been performing its self-cleaning function for any significant portion of that time, then Miss Simeon has probably seen its effects more often than most. She has outlasted generations of Elmore's residents. She has watched people disappear and be forgotten, and presumably she's noticed the pattern of that. But he teaches geography. He's geography. She sets homework. She tells Gumball he's failing. She exists within the structures of normal Elmore life, with a thoroughness that suggests either complete acceptance of those structures or a very deliberate choice to inhabit them rather than question them. There's something almost restful about the idea of someone that old deciding that the most useful thing they can do with their existence is be annoying to middle schoolers. As if, after 300,000 years of watching everything happen, the only appropriate response is to give out poor marks and argue with the principal about who forgot to put the recycling out. The relationship between Miss Simeon and Principal Brown deserves more than a passing mention, because it's one of the show's more interesting ongoing background stories. Brown himself is not ancient. He's a conventional adult age for a school principal, which means that whatever their romantic history is, it's not simply a matter of them having known each other for centuries. At some point in Brown's life, within his normal humanish lifespan, he encountered Miss Simeon, and they became whatever they are, on again, off again, perpetually complicated, apparently committed to each other in some baseline way despite everything. What would it be like to be in a relationship with someone for whom your entire existence constitutes a brief period in her personal history? Brown will presumably age and change, and eventually die in the normal way of mortal beings, while Miss Simeon will continue teaching geography to the next generation of Elmore Junior High students. He is, in her timeline, an episode. She is, in his, the whole story. The show doesn't dwell on this. It's played almost exclusively for comedy. The bickering couple, the exasperated principal, the short-tempered, prehistoric ape who seems to find his enthusiasm slightly exhausting. But the structural fact of their relationship, when you hold it up to the light, is one of the stranger things in a show full of strange things. The other element of Miss Simeon's backstory that occasionally surfaces is her student history at Elmore Junior High. She attended the school herself, at some point several 100,000 years ago, presumably when it was a very different kind of institution. The show never depicts this period in any detail, but it does establish that she has been in relationship with this specific institution, as student and then teacher, for longer than most civilizations have existed. She didn't just find a stable job, she found a stable relationship with a place, and she's committed to it with a consistency that makes Larry's multi-employment look like dilettantism. One of the more fascinating implications of Miss Simeon's age, which I touched on earlier but want to expand slightly, is what it suggests about Elmore's. Miss Simeon is over 2 million years old. And years old. She attended Elmore Junior High as a student, which means Elmore Junior High has existed, in some form, for several 100,000 years. It has been running a continuous academic program, giving out report cards and scheduling assemblies and having sports days and dealing with difficult students for longer than most of human civilization. This raises a question about the void. If the void is Elmore's self-cleaning mechanism, and if Elmore has been running for hundreds of thousands of years, then the void has been performing this function for that entire period. Generations of students have attended the school. Some have graduated, some have presumably been sent to the void. Some are presumably still in there. The scale of the void's operation, when you hold it against the timeline implied by Miss Simeon's existence, becomes genuinely vast. It's not a mechanism that's been running for a decade or two. It's been managing Elmore's population for geological time. And it has been doing this quietly, without the residents knowing, clearing the deck for the next round of stories. The question of whether the current iteration of Elmore, the version we watch in the series, is the first time these particular kinds of stories have been told, or one of many cycles running across that long timeline, is one the show doesn't address directly, but it's there in the background, implicit in the arithmetic of Miss Simeon's age. The show we're watching might be one episode of a much longer broadcast. The simulation theory applied to Elmore is not quite the same as the simulation theory applied to, say, our own universe, though the structural questions are similar. In both cases you're asking, is what appears to be a natural, self-governing reality actually a constructed environment, one that operates according to rules determined by some external agency? For Elmore, the evidence is fairly substantial. The void actively removes errors, maintaining the simulation's coherence. The universe resists being understood, specifically preventing characters from knowing their own nature. Background characters appear to have roles rather than lives, serving narrative functions and disappearing when those functions are complete. The laws of physics in Elmore are negotiable in ways that suggest they're settings rather than constants. And then there's the question of Gumball's 13th birthday. This comes from a fan theory, fairly well circulated in Gumball fandom spaces, that draws on a couple of pieces of evidence. First, Gumball is 12 for the entire run of the show. He doesn't age. His birthday is mentioned, but its consequences are never demonstrated in any permanent way. He remains 12 in Season 6, just as he was 12 in Season 1, despite the years that pass in production time. Second, Banana Barbara, in one of her less specific warnings, says there is no future. The void is approaching. And some fans have connected this specifically to the idea that Gumball turning 13 would mean he's no longer a child protagonist, and a world structured around a 12-year-old's adventures would lose its central premise if he aged out of it. The universe of Elmore exists to tell a certain kind of story. If the main character stops being the kind of character that story requires, the story ends. And the void is what happens when stories end. There's also the episode called The Vegetals, which contains a detail about the void's intelligence that's been read in various ways. The suggestion is that if nothing plot relevant happens in Elmore, the void will make something happen. The universe needs plot. It requires ongoing story to sustain itself. The inhabitants of Elmore aren't just characters in a show, they're the mechanism by which the show's existence is continually justified. As long as Gumball and Darwin and the rest keep having adventures, keep generating narrative, keep being interesting enough to watch, Elmore continues. The moment the interesting stops, the void starts, which is a strange pressure to live under if you're a resident of Elmore. Your continued existence depends not just on being relevant in the way Rob learned to his cost, but on being narratively active. Quiet lives don't sustain simulation universes. You have to keep the story going. Now, the thing that the simulation theory runs into, and the reason I don't think the answer to whether Elmore is a simulation actually matters as much as the question, is that the characters' experiences are real regardless of what produces them. Gumball's anxiety about school is real. His feelings for Penny are real. His love for Darwin is real. Nicole's exhaustion at the end of a long day is real. Richard's genuine warmth toward his children is real. The fact that these experiences might be generated by a constructed environment rather than an organic one doesn't change their texture or their truth. A feeling doesn't become less real because the universe that produces it was designed rather than evolved. The show seems to know this. It gestures at the simulation question through the meta-narrative and then consistently steps back from fully resolving it, because the resolution would require either confirming that the characters' inner lives are somehow less genuine, which the show clearly doesn't believe, or acknowledging that the distinction between a real universe and a simulated one might not be as meaningful as it first appears. If everything you experience is real to you, in the most fundamental phenomenological sense, does it matter what produces it? Elmore's residents live fully, love genuinely, suffer sincerely, find joy and meaning and connection in ways that feel as solid as anything. Whether that's because their universe is organic or because it's a very good simulation seems, at that point, like a fairly academic concern. One specific episode that I find interesting in the context of the simulation question is the finale from the end of Season 2. The finale is essentially a clip show, but with a framing device. Every character Gumball has ever wronged throughout the series comes back and tries to get revenge simultaneously. It's a catalogue of consequences. Every mess that was previously reset, every problem that was apparently solved and forgotten, suddenly all arriving at once. And then at the end of the episode, the story jumps 1,000 years into the future. The universe essentially applies a patch. Everything goes back to normal. The characters who were wronged forget they were wronged. The slate is wiped. Gumball and Darwin walk away from the consequences of their accumulated actions in the way they walk away from consequences every episode. The show presents this reset as a joke. Haha, everything's fine again, consequences don't stick in cartoons. But in the context of Elmore's mythology, it's something else. It's the void doing maintenance. It's the universe running a correction process to restore the status quo after a period of excessive disruption. The system glitched, too many things accumulated, and it performed a rollback. This happens in regular episodes too, but the finale makes it visible and explicit. The consequence immunity that the Wattersons enjoy isn't just a cartoon convention. In Elmore's terms, it's evidence of the universe actively managing the narrative. The Wattersons can't be permanently damaged because they're the main characters. And permanently damaging the main characters would destabilize the story, and destabilizing the story would feed the void. They are, in a specific sense, protected by their own importance to the narrative, and this is why Rob's early antagonism against them is doomed from the start. Before any question of competence, he's trying to cause permanent harm to the people the universe has decided are structurally central. The universe won't allow it. It will reset around them every time. He isn't just fighting the Wattersons, he's fighting the narrative itself. Every long-running show accumulates loose threads. Characters who are introduced and then mostly forgotten. Plot points that get seeded and never harvested. Implications that the show gestures toward and then doesn't follow through on, either because it ran out of time, or because it was never entirely sure what to do with them, or because it thought the suggestion was more interesting than the answer would be. Gumball has quite a few of these, and I find them oddly enjoyable to sit with. Not in a frustrated, the show should have fixed this way, more in the way that unexplored rooms in a house you love have their own appeal. You know they're there, you don't know quite what's in them. That's fine. Daisy the donkey. Daisy is Aeneas's stuffed toy, present in her life from the beginning of the show, and increasingly strange as the series progresses. She appears in Banana Barbara's paintings, which is already unusual. She moves on her own in The Night, an episode that's played fairly straight, as a creepy premise rather than pure comedy. She seems, in various moments scattered across the series, to have her own agenda in a way that stuffed toys definitively should not. In Season 6, she largely disappears from Anais's storylines without explanation. The show doesn't address it. Anais moves on apparently. The Daisy the Donkey in-universe TV show still exists and is referenced occasionally, but the specific doll, the one with the implied consciousness and the unsettling smile, just sort of stops being there. Fan theories about Daisy range from fairly mundane, Anais simply grew out of her, as children grow out of toys, and the show depicted this realistically, if obliquely, to considerably more elaborate. Daisy knew something about Elmore's structure, and Anais found out, and the doll had to go. The truth is probably in the mundane category, but the elaborate one is more interesting, so. The Shady Man. He appears occasionally throughout the series as the proprietor of the Awesome Store, the van that sells objects capable of manipulating Elmore's reality. We've mentioned him in the context of the meta-narrative section. He seems to understand what Elmore is in a way that most characters don't. He exists at the edges of the show's world rather than inside it. The original series never explains who he is, where he came from, or what his interest in Elmore's stability or instability might be. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball begins to address this, but at the point the original show, Lee Rob eventually inherits his role as owner of the Awesome Store, which raises questions about the succession. Which raises questions about the succession. Was it planned? Did the Shady Man choose Rob? Or did Rob simply move into a vacancy? Molly Collins. Molly was erased by the void, rescued by Gumball and Darwin, and had her memory of the whole thing wiped on return. She went back to school. She's just there, a normal student, presumably having no idea that she spent some period of time in the cosmic rubbish dimension because the universe decided she was boring. The show doesn't really follow up on Molly. She appears in the background occasionally. She doesn't have much of a storyline after The Void, which is itself a bit of a comment on the situation. The most interesting thing that ever happened to her, and she can't access it. And the show moves on to other things in much the same way that Elmore moved on when she was originally erased. There's something quietly melancholy in that. You went to the void and came back, and the only people who know don't remember it properly either, and your classmates don't know, and you don't know, and you just attend school and exist in the background of other people's more memorable storylines, which, come to think of it, is exactly the situation that sent her there in the first place. The rescue was a kindness, but it left her in essentially the same position. Anton's clones are worth a mention. Anton is the toast student, and it is demonstrated in the recipe that his parents can produce new versions of him from a toaster. When Anton dies, which the show occasionally depicts with cheerful casualness, a new Anton emerges. He appears to retain his memories and personality despite the reset of his physical form. The show plays this primarily as dark comedy, but the existential question is sitting right there for anyone who wants to find it. Are all the Antons the same person? Is there a continuity of self that persists through the toasting process? The show's answer is, essentially, yes, Anton is Anton, and we're moving on, which is probably the right call for the show's register, but leaves the philosophical question unexamined. There are smaller threads too. The secret society of Elmore Junior High that appears in one episode and isn't particularly explained. The question of what William the Eye actually does beyond being an eye at school. The origins of several of the more abstract characters, whose physical nature the show never quite accounts for. Elmore is full of these small unexplained things, and I think that's part of what gives it the texture of a place, rather than a set. Places have unexplained corners. You don't know everything about anywhere you live. The show built a town with rooms it didn't fully furnish, and it turns out that's what makes it feel real. A few more loose threads that I didn't get to earlier. Hot Dog Guy is worth mentioning. He's a recurring character who appears very frequently throughout the series as a background presence, occasionally interacting with Gumball and Darwin, never getting a plot or a name beyond the descriptive. He simply exists in the margins of the show, this orange hot dog person, reappearing reliably across seasons. He's become something of a beloved figure in the fandom precisely because of his persistent, purposeless background presence. The show never explains him. He just keeps showing up. The internet as a character. In one episode, the internet is a literal character in Elmore, a dangerous, chaotic presence that Gumball and Darwin navigate as a physical environment. The show's depictions of online culture, social media, and digital life are generally pretty sharp for a children's cartoon and generally pretty dark. The world depicted in the Internet as Place episode is specifically unpleasant, full of bad actors and hostile spaces and the specific texture of online chaos. It's one of those episodes where the comedy's doing something and the thing it's doing is a fairly pointed observation about what we've built. The copycats from one of the later seasons deserve a mention as a mystery that the show resolves almost too neatly. They're a family who appear to be direct copies of the Wattersons, and the episode that introduces them gestures at various sinister explanations before settling into a more straightforwardly comedic resolution. But the question of what a family of Watterson copies represents, in a universe where identity and originality are structurally significant, feels like it had more to offer than the episode gave it. Carrie's father, trapped in a mirror, is another thread that gets introduced and then sort of left. He's there, in the mirror, a man who was cursed. Carrie knows about him. She visits occasionally. The show never quite gets around to the full version of that story. It's one of the older, darker implied histories that the show built for characters to give them texture without necessarily intending to fully explore. And William, the floating eye, who attends Elmore Junior High and has never, in the entire run of the series, spoken a word or had an episode centered on him. He's just there, watching, blinking occasionally. What William knows is one of the great unanswered questions of the Gumball universe. He is the mystery that never becomes a story. And sometimes that's the most interesting kind of mystery to have. The show's relationship with endings is worth a specific observation as we close out. Gumball has, across its run, depicted a number of in-universe endings, finales within episodes, moments of resolution and completion, and it approaches them with a kind of honest ambivalence that feels consistent with the show's overall philosophy. The finale, the Season 2 episode that catalogues all of the show's accumulated consequences only to have them reset, is both a joke about the impossibility of cartoon endings and a genuine exploration of why the reset exists and what it means. The show can't let things end permanently. within episodes, because permanent endings within the ongoing series would change everything. So it depicts the reset and acknowledges the reset and makes the reset part of the show's self-understanding rather than hiding it. The Inquisition is the actual ending, or the ending of the original series, and it is specifically an unending, a cliffhanger, a moment of suspension that refuses resolution. The show's final image is a freeze frame of a character in the process of being lost, and the audience is left to carry that image forward without knowing what happens next. For years, that was just how it was. The story stopped in the middle of a sentence. There's an argument that this is the most honest way the show could have ended, given everything it had been saying about the nature of Elmore. A world that runs on the suppression of endings, that maintains itself through the refusal to conclude, that keeps its characters in a permanent present tense so the story can continue indefinitely, was always going to have difficulty ending with any finality. The cliffhanger doesn't break the show's promise, it fulfills it. Elmore doesn't end. The screen just went dark for a while, and then the screen came back on, as screens do. And Elmore was still there, still the same mixed media mess, still full of the same characters, in the same permanent present, still running the same story, with the same questions open, and the same warmth intact. Which is, honestly, rather reassuring. Good night. I've been circling around this throughout the whole video, but I want to state it plainly before we close. The reason the theories around Gumball are so well developed, so internally consistent, so rewarding to think through, is that the show deserved them. It earned them. It put the work in across all those years to build a world with genuine depth, and then it trusted its audience to find that depth rather than pointing at it. This is rarer than it should be. A lot of animated shows aimed at children and families treat their audience as passive receivers of content, to be entertained for 20 minutes and then replaced by the next thing. Gumball treated its audience as collaborators. It put things in the corners and let you find them. It built a mythology and let you map it. It asked questions it didn't answer and trusted you to sit with them. The Rob arc only lands the way it does because the show spent 2 seasons. Banana Barbara's prophecies only have weight because the show scattered them across seasons and mostly let viewers connect them as foreshadowing on their own. Don't point at them and say, "Look, foreshadowing." The meta-narrative only earns its emotional resonance because the comedy was good enough on its own terms that you were invested in the world before the world started asking its larger questions. All of this is to say, the mysteries of Gumball are interesting because the show is interesting. The theories exist because the lore rewarded theory making. And the reason people still care about a cartoon that ended its original run in 2019 is that it gave them things to care about that weren't finished at the close of the last episode. Elmore is still out there, in the wonderfully weird world continuity, and in the accumulated re-watchings and fan discussions and late-night videos like this one. The questions are still open, the void is still there. And somewhere in Elmore Junior High, a small blue cat who never quite turns 13 is making a poor decision that will create moderate civic disruption by the end of the afternoon. Some things, it turns out, are worth being unresolved. Gumball was part of a generation of Cartoon Network shows that took the medium seriously as a storytelling vehicle rather than just a delivery mechanism for advertising adjacent content. Shows like Adventure Time, Regular Show, Steven Universe, and Gravity Falls were doing similar work in the same period, building genuine mythologies within animated formats that were ostensibly aimed at children. What makes Gumball slightly different from its contemporaries is how invisible its ambition was in the early going. Adventure Time announced its depth relatively quickly. Gravity Falls was clearly doing an overarching mystery from the beginning. Gumball looked, for the first couple of seasons, like a fairly conventional comedy show that happened to have excellent visual design. The depth was there, but it was quiet about itself. This means the show's legacy is slightly underweighted in some of the cultural conversations about ambitious children's animation from the 2010s, it doesn't get mentioned as consistently as Adventure Time or Steven Universe in discussions about cartoons that did serious storytelling, partly because its humour obscured its seriousness, partly because the Gumball's ending was a cliffhanger, and follow-up projects and a forthcoming revival later arrived. .te as a complete work until the revival arrived. But within the fandom, the engagement remains deep and genuinely scholarly in a way that speaks to what the show built. People are still mapping Banana Barbara's paintings, people are still analysing Rob's arc, people are still having conversations about the Void and what the Inquisition means, and whether Gumball's centrality to Elmore is structural or coincidental. This kind of sustained engagement doesn't happen for shows that didn't earn it. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball being available to new generations of viewers through Hulu means that the original series is also finding new audiences who can watch all 6 seasons with the knowledge of where they lead and discover the layered foreshadowing that early viewers had to wait years to understand. If anything, the original series plays better in retrospect than it did on original broadcast because the things it was setting up across those first few seasons are now readable as setup rather than background noise. One last thing I want to say, because I think it matters. Gumball is technically a children's show. It was made for Cartoon Network. It aired at times when children would be watching. Its primary audience in terms of demographic targeting was young people. And it did things that children's entertainment is often told not to do. It dealt with existential erasure. It built a villain whose tragedy was the core of his characterization. It depicted a universe with a self-cleaning mechanism that removes the irrelevant without sentiment. It ended its original run with a cliffhanger in which the world began to be consumed by oblivion. It asked repeatedly, and without fully answering, whether the feelings of fictional beings are real, and whether the people watching them are any different. These are not conventionally child-appropriate themes. They're philosophy, and the show embedded them in comedy and physical gags and Finn and Jake's various adventures and emotional crises, and delivered them to children in a form that was accessible and entertaining without being condescending. And entertaining without being condescending. Children understand more than they're given credit for, including things that adults find uncomfortable. They know about unfairness. They know about feeling invisible. They know about the fear of not mattering, of being the kid nobody notices. They know that the world has mechanisms for removing people from consideration. They don't have the vocabulary for it yet, often, but the experience is familiar. Gumball met children where they were with this knowledge and validated it through comedy and cosmology in a way that said, yes, you're right, the world is like this, and you can also survive in it, and you're not alone in noticing, which is, ultimately, what the best children's art does. Not protecting young people from reality, but giving them tools and company for the reality they already inhabit. That's what these mysteries add up to, I think. Not just clever world building or impressive lore. A show that took its audience seriously enough to tell them the truth about some fairly hard things, wrapped in the funniest possible packaging, trusting them to find what they needed in it. Right, I think that's actually everything. We've been through quite a lot of Elmore tonight. I hope it's been a comfortable wander. The wonderfully weird world of Gumball arrived on Hulu in 2025, which means the story isn't quite over. The cliffhanger has been picked up. Rob was rescued from the void by the awesome store owner. The threat of Elmore's erasure continues to develop. Gumball and Darwin are still getting into things. The Wattersons are still on Evergreen Terrace. I haven't watched all of it yet. Some of it? Yes, enough to be glad it exists and glad that the story has somewhere to go. But we're not going to talk about the revival in detail tonight because this was a video about the mysteries of the original series, the things it left open and the theories it inspired, and I think that's the right boundary to observe. What I will say is this: The Amazing World of Gumball is a show that started as a visual curiosity, a collection of rejected designs given a home, and became something considerably stranger and more ambitious over 6 years. It built a mythology about fictionality and erasure, and the question of what it means to matter in a world that can delete you. It wrapped all of that in the most visually chaotic, cheerfully anarchic packaging imaginable, which meant that a lot of people who watched it as children absorbed its ideas without quite knowing they were absorbing anything. The theories we've talked about tonight, the void, Rob's arc, Banana Barbara's paintings, Darwin's origins, Penny's shell, Larry's survival strategy, the meta-narrative, the Inquisition's real-world resonances, these aren't things imposed on the show from outside. They're things the show actually put there, clearly enough to be found by anyone paying a certain kind of attention. The show invited this reading. It was doing it on purpose. And I think the thing that makes it stick, the reason people still talk about it years after it ended, and will presumably continue to talk about it as long as the revival keeps going, is that it was genuinely kind beneath all the weirdness. The Wattersons are chaotic. They cause problems. They create messes. They exhaust Larry and terrify the neighbours and occasionally break municipal infrastructure. But they love each other, simply and completely, in a way that the show never finds sentimental or embarrassing. The chaos and the love are the same thing. You can't have one without the other. And for Gumball, whose universe might be a simulation and whose continued existence might depend on being narratively interesting, and whose best friend is an evolved goldfish, and whose girlfriend is a shape-shifting fairy who spent 3 seasons inside a peanut, the most reliable thing in Elmore is his family. Not because they're capable or organised or good at things, but because they're there, consistently, reliably, in the same house on Evergreen Terrace. Every reset, every episode, every time. There's something quite restful about that, actually. If you're still listening, I hope it's been a gentle hour or two. If you drifted off around the bit about Larry's jobs, or Miss Simeon's prehistory, or Banana Barbara's prophecies, that's exactly as intended. The mysteries of Elmore will still be there when you wake up, unresolved and comfortable, the way good mysteries tend to be. Sleep well. Good night.